Good evening and welcome to this exciting discussion. My name is Torchia and I will be the chair for tonight. This meeting has been organized by the Venezuela We Are With You Coalition and the Center for Social Justice. Co-sponsors of this event are the Canadian Forum for Justice and Peace in Sri Lanka, the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, Colombia Action Solidarity Alliance, Latin American Solidarity Network, Migrante Ontario, Bayan Canada, and Toronto Haiti Action Committee. That are the co-sponsors, and we are very happy that these organizations are with us today, and we hope in the future we are still working together, because we need a lot of hands in order to build a real solidarity movement with the third world people. We thank to the Center for Social Justice for facilitating the place, as usually they do, but we thank them once again. Thank you. The subject to be discussed tonight is the crisis and the global south, as you know. So people in North America and around the world are being affected by the deepest economic crisis to shake the capitalist system in decades. We are witnesses factories closing, bankruptcies, home foreclosures, unemployment and underemployment, and poverty on the rise. Economists say that this crisis will be severe and long, and that perhaps the recession will become a depression. So many questions arise, and we hope that the debate tonight will throw light on them. Is this crisis simply the result of the neoliberal deregulation of the financial sector, which led the subprime mortgage bubble to burst? Or does the severity of the financial crisis flow from a fundamental contradiction in the real economy, means in the production sphere? Who will pay for this crisis? In other words, is there a win-win solution that would benefit both capitalists and workers? What will be the effect of the crisis in the global south? Will the worker, the poor, the peasant of the third world agree to pay the bill, or will another round of structured adjustment program impulsed by the International Monetary Fund be imposed from the imperialist countries in Latin America, Asia, or Africa, recomposing the capitalist economy on the shoulders of the people? Are we seeing in the South the articulation of response to the crisis? We know that in Venezuela there is some project, for instance, to the National Assembly approved $42 billion to secure food for the people. In Argentina, the government nationalized the private pension plan funds in order to have a shelter to deal with the crisis. We know that in Bolivia, too, there's some kind of a measure that will protect the population. But what we know about that? And what are the tasks for the left? We are socialists. I am a socialist. What are the tasks that I have to address in order to help the working class here in North America, but also to build solidarity with the poor, the working class, the peasantry, and the third world? This is the question that we have. So to debate these vital issues, we have tonight three knowledgeable panelists: Hanieh, Niraj, Joshi, and Paul Kellogg. So Niraj, Joshi is a Toronto activist who is a committee coordinator with the Toronto Haiti Action Committee and the Canada Haiti Action Committee. Paul Kellogg teaches in the Department of International Development Studies at Trent University in Peterborough. He's a member of the Coordinating Committee of the Coalition Venezuela We Are With You. And Hanieh is a doctoral student at York University, and he's a member of the Coordinating Committee of the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid.
three things here. Firstly, I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the causes of the crisis and how we can understand the crisis, how it has evolved at a global level. Secondly, looking at the impact of the economic crisis on the South and some of the ways that this may happen. And thirdly, looking at the past political implications and to make some comments around that. So, firstly, looking at how this crisis began, or some of the ways in which or the causes of the crisis. I think it's very important to see this crisis as a global crisis. That the way the system, the world economy, the world market developed over the last 2 decades under neoliberalism is a big reason for this crisis, or the big reason for the crisis actually evolving. The crisis is not caused by bad real estate markets in the United States. It's not caused by poor regulation of financial markets in the US. It's not caused by banks giving out too many mortgages to people who can't pay in the US. It really needs to be seen in its global context. So, in order to kind of put it in that sense, we need to we need to see what happened globally since the beginning of the 1980s, under the period of neoliberalism. What I want to basically argue is that what evolved over the last 2 decades is a global economy that was very unevenly structured, where different countries, different regions kind of plugged into a global world market in a very hierarchical manner, where every economy of the globe was essentially structured around the accumulation of large corporations centered in the advanced capitalist countries, basically in North America, in Europe, and in Japan, or in East Asia, as the centers of accumulation. But every country in the world kind of plugged into this structure. So if we look at the South, and this is to be very schematic, and it's more complicated than what I'm saying, but if we look at the South, there were essentially 3 ways that countries in the South were inserted into this global system. Firstly, there were countries whose role essentially was as low-wage production zones, okay, where there was poor regulation, very low wages, and manufacturing at a global level essentially relocated to these low-wage production zones. Okay, so we know, for example, the case of China is one, but there are many other cases in India, in Mexico, other places in Latin America, where capital moved to take advantage of low wages. It happened also at a regional level. So there were, for example, economic processing zones set up in Asia, which would make use of cheap labor. For example, zones set up in Malaysia that would make use of cheap labor from Indonesia or the Philippines or neighboring countries. So this kind of hierarchy happened not just at a global level, but also regionally. Secondly, there were many countries that basically became labor exporters. Okay, exporters of migrant labor. So and this was particularly the case in Latin America and the Caribbean. Many countries, a large proportion of their GDP is made up of labor exports. So, for example, Honduras, 26% of Honduras, the GDP, comes from remittances sent from labor working abroad. The same thing, very high proportion in Guyana, in Haiti. The figure is 22% of remittances, of GDP from remittances. And then thirdly, the third kind of way that countries were plugged into this structure, countries in the South, was as raw commodity exporters. So, for example, Africa, the regions of the continent of Africa, a very large number of, a high proportion of global mineral exports coming from Africa, and of course we know the Middle East as oil exporting countries. I'm not trying to imply that every country just played one of those roles. In many cases, for example, Mexico, countries played all three of those roles as low-wage zones, as exporters of labor, as well as commodity exporters, raw commodity exporters. The other end of this system was consumption in North America, particularly in the United States, okay? Or consumption in the advanced capitalist countries, but particularly in the United States. So the US role essentially was as where goods were exported to, okay? And the US consumer was the driver, therefore, of world demand. So the US consumer, 70% of the US GDP is made up of private consumption, okay, by consumption of private consumers. So this consumption in the core countries, in places such as the United States, was largely financed through the mechanism of debt. So one of the ways that people were able to keep up this accumulation or this consumption was through going massively into debt. It might mean you take out a mortgage on your house. You basically use your house as an ATM machine, get a mortgage, you get some money, you go and buy your goods, and you can keep turning it over as long as the value of your house is going up. So when this system started to collapse and mortgages, the real estate prices start to drop, it means that this demand actually starts to shrink. Okay, and this is why the financial crisis has really started to echo now into a major production crisis. Okay, globally, manufacturing and production is shrinking at a very, very rapid rate, and this is really the most serious part of the crisis. It's not what's happening necessarily on the stock markets or in terms of the financial markets. So, and I want to just quickly now move on to the second part, which is looking at how the crisis, therefore, as this crisis in production unfolds, what kind of impact will it have on the South? Firstly, we should see that many of these countries that were low-wage production zones are going to face massive closures, factory closures, and massive levels of unemployment. And this is already beginning to happen. For example, in Turkey, in many sectors of the Turkish economy, 40%, they've seen 40% drops in their exports of some commodities, for example, automobile manufacturing. So unemployment has risen to now around 11% in Turkey in a very, very short period of time. Likewise, in China, as a major low-wage zone, Chinese growth has also dramatically shrunk. Now the prediction is around 5% growth in GDP, which might sound very high, but China needs to have a growth rate of around 9 to 10% in order to absorb the millions of workers that enter the economy each year. So we're talking about each year around 24 million workers enter the Chinese economy. So a growth rate of 5%, when you need a growth rate of 10% to actually sustain and open, it means a massive social dislocation for these workers. So that's at the level of these low-wage production zones. At the level of migrant labour and remittances, the collapse in production means that workers who used to send home remittances are no longer able to do so. So countries that have a very high dependency on this really are faced with a massive balance of payment crisis. So for example, El Salvador, where 70% of the national or the foreign income to El Salvador comes from remittances, okay, and it's the figure for their exports is around 3% or something. You see what happens if that remittances source gets cut off. Okay, so does this mean I've done 10? I've got 10. More than I thought. So this means it's not only a problem for the money, the flows that will be coming into the economy, but it also is a problem for It is also a problem for unemployment levels in these countries as well, because it means if these workers return to the domestic economy. Finally, the primary commodity exporters. The drop in commodity prices has been huge because of the drop in global manufacturing. So world trade levels is one indication of this. The trade levels have dropped a large amount. So for example, one measure of this is something called the Baltic Dry Index, which measures cost of shipping. This was dropped by 92% from June to January. So it means a ship that cost $234,000, one of the large tankers to export, to ship like iron or coal or steel, now only costs around $2,000. It dropped from $234,000 to just over $2,000 in price. So you can see this drop in the cost of shipping is indicative of the drop in world trade and therefore of the drop in commodity prices, which will have a very huge impact on places like Latin America and Africa. For example, Zambia, a country, has lost 2/3 of its foreign income in the last couple of months, 2/3. And this is a country where it has around 50% unemployment, according to some sources. The other implication, which I don't have time to go into, is around financial flows and dropping of financial flows into these countries. So what this means is that, and we are already starting to see this, is a very rapid return of the International Monetary Fund into a very central position in the global economy. Countries, because of the crisis, are being forced by the IMF to implement very harsh structural adjustment programs in order to receive funds as a lifeline to get them to basically survive temporarily the crisis. So this is one aspect of the crisis we should be aware of. So in terms of I'll finish here with the political implications. I think firstly we should see that there will be a great temptation in countries such as Canada to return to, or amongst the left and other social movements, to retreat back to just the bread and butter issues. To forget about international solidarity in particular as being a core aspect of left politics and of trade union and labour politics as well. So I think this is one thing that we in this room as international solidarity activists and from different communities, we need to be very careful and aware that this will be the temptation, and also be prepared to make the arguments of why international solidarity at this turn is just as important, if not more important, than at any other phase. Secondly, part of this will be expressed as an economic nationalism, that we should just worry about Canada and Canadian workers and Canadian jobs instead of the broader international perspective. Thirdly, and I'm really rushing through this, this is more to throw it out for discussion, but thirdly, we need to see how the global system, which I described, is reflected back in places or cities such as Toronto. It means, for example, migrant workers here will also face the brunt of these types of restructuring that we're seeing. So migrant workers and a ratcheting up of racism as the state kind of implements these attacks. Fourthly, militarism and a return to forms of the Canadian state, the US state, and other advanced capitalist states expanding military power overseas, and we can see that very clearly is happening. So as part of the response, trying to make targeting those things. The final comment I would make is that what this means is that it's very important that our struggles as international solidarity struggles remain or become much closely united. That we see our struggles not as being separate, not as being divided from one another, but actually see the common causes, the common issues that we encounter in our day-to-day struggles. And I think really it is our responsibility as people in this room who do this work to make sure that we deepen the forms of collaboration that we take into the next period. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start off by thanking the organizers for the invitation, and especially Suzanne for the opportunity to speak about Haiti, who remain committed to Haiti solidarity, have been struggling for some time to keep Haiti in focus amidst the urgency of all the other very important and critical solidarity struggles. So I really appreciate having Haiti included as part of this discussion, this dialogue. I also have to admit that I feel somewhat inadequate among the expertise represented on this panel, and especially because I'm not accustomed to speaking in public, and so I hope what I have to say will contribute something to the discussion we're going to have. I'm going to speak a little bit of background about what's happening in Haiti right now, just to put it in context, because I think it's very, very important. Because it's difficult to speak meaningfully about the impact of a global economic crisis, this financial meltdown in the world's most richest economies on one of the world's most impoverished. In a country where not only are so many people already living on the edge, in fact, the economic disaster of the magnitude that has already been underway for a very long time in Haiti is difficult to conceive of in most countries. But then compound that hardship with a country that is at the same time militarily, economically, and administratively occupied. And you have the reality of the tragic reality of Haiti today. A country where, as Peter Hallward, author Peter Hallward calls a tiny transnational clique of wealthy and well-connected families maintain an illegal politic grip on international trade, on industrial production, as well as political and social life. While 80% of their fellow citizens live in abject poverty, 75% surviving on less than $2 a day, a 70% unemployment rate, an average life expectancy of 52 years, a raging health crisis, grave HIV and AIDS infection rates, and you get the idea. So Haiti is already in the depths of crisis. And as Haiti's first democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, said that Haiti's exceptional poverty is a result of an exceptional history, one that goes back to everything that you were saying about neoliberalism and what happened through the 1980s, and one that extracted an equally exceptional wealth. And what he's referring to still actually remains both the starting and the ending point of Haiti's present reality. The 2 centuries of imperial intervention with the most recent manifestation, the violent Canadian, American, and French 2004 coup d'etat, which left thousands dead, displaced, imprisoned, and exiled, and the imposition of a disastrous regime of human rights abuses for 2 years under direct United Nations sanction. And so this 2004 coup was just another crushing blow to Haiti's remarkable democratic movement of the poor majority, which was also struggling right then after the effects of the 1980s, when it was most profound, and has resulted in an economic, social, and political setback for that nation of decades. And although Haiti currently has, as many of you may know, a constitutional government under President René Prevel, the same 3 countries, Canada, the US, and France, play a main role in ostensibly financing that government. And I say ostensibly because the majority of the funds are actually diverted to a plethora of NGOs and not the government. Thousands of them operate in Haiti. For example, the agricultural department in Haiti shares control of its agricultural budget with some 800 different NGOs. And the majority of those are not even listed with the government, so they operate independently. And so these wealthy foreign nations are directing Haiti's domestic policy domestic policy decisions as part of this 10,000 member foreign military, police, and political contingent, again, under direct United Nations sponsorship. And the coup and the current occupation is actually is a continuation. It's probably more accurately a culmination of years of American, World Bank, IMF, economic policy impositions that has turned Haiti into that low wage, the lowest wage in the hemisphere, in fact, export-friendly, most open world economy that's providing profitable business as well as resource extraction opportunities for foreign investors. A strategy that has taken Haiti from impoverished self-sufficiency to outright destitution and dependency that we see today. So under these conditions and neoliberal conditionalities, a world economic crisis that even results in a few points uptick in inflation or a couple of points drop in GDP does not impact on basic needs for Haitians, for poor Haitians, but it impacts on survival itself. And at the same time that the constitutional government isn't allowed to implement its own development or economic recovery plan, shockingly little has been done under foreign and international financial institutions' control from the period of 2004 to the present. Haiti's infrastructure remains crippled. Most institutional building programs that were promised have not even begun, and no significant money has been put into building roads or markets or healthcare or any other infrastructure for people. And so, as I said, the totality of the Haitian government's budget comes from outside. And so, under an intensification of an economic crisis, the Haitian state has very little capacity for generating revenue. Even part of the central bank is being sold in a recapitalization operation, and tax laws have been revised only to spur private sector development. And at the same time, the parliament itself is only nominally or minimally functional because, again, of foreign-led constraint and these confusing elections. So for the last year, for example, only 5 major laws were passed in Haiti. So it's important to consider the economic crisis again alongside this ongoing political crisis and in the midst of a multiplicity of crises in relation to food, health, climate, energy, and of course sovereignty. And so that's not to say that the foreign occupiers aren't making some preparations, because they are. In fact, the U.S. is funding, as part of its development aid in Haiti, a military base for MINUSTA, which is the United Nations military force. It's in Cité Soleil, Haiti's largest slum and the hotbed of resistance. And of course it makes sense because military domination of this northern flank of Haiti's capital is critical if you expect growing unrest with the worsening economic crisis, just as it has dealt with unrest over the past 5 years. Many of you might recall the soaring global food prices and that crippled many poor countries, and which in Haiti, of course, meant outright starvation. You have the poorest Haitians surviving by consuming cakes of toxic clay baked under the Haitian sun. The economic, of course, liberalization programs in the 80s under IMF structural adjustment programs has made it impossible for Haiti to control its own food supply. And so more than half of the island's food is imported. So when you had that surge in global prices, it hit Haiti, especially hard. It was devastating, and it continues to be. And the extended fallout was, of course, under the conditions that I've outlined in this country, is that you had angry protests throughout the nation, directed both at what was seen as an unresponsive government, but most importantly also at the military occupation, MINUSTA, and protests that were violently dispersed and suppressed by police and UN forces, killing at least 5 starving Haitians with scores injured and the dismissal of a prime minister and consequent paralyzing of parliament for months. And as a further tragedy, the food crisis was followed by the hurricanes in the fall, and once again you had this foreign occupying force putting nothing in place to mitigate the effects of the expected disaster, which killed 1,000 people, displaced several thousands, flooded almost all the agricultural land, and destroyed the season's almost the entire harvest. and the World Bank put the aggregated damage of that loss of agriculture and infrastructure at $900 million, 15% of Haiti's GDP, representing the largest disaster in Haiti in the last 100 years. And once again, consequences that were hardly natural, though the initial hurricanes were. And so the Haitian government complained that it became impossible to coordinate the relief work among, again, the many different and disparate international aid agencies. And just as a note, 90% of that aid that was supposed to come for hurricane relief never arrived, while some $197 million, which the Haitian government tried to release from its central bank, wasn't dispersed because it had been placed in U.S. financial markets. And that happened without consultation with the Haitian parliament. So these two events illustrate, I think, the complexity of challenges that Haitians and their government will face when confronting a financial crisis. And so as Haiti celebrated its 205th anniversary of independence, on January 1st of just this month, President Prevel's bleak message to his occupied nation was that not to, quote unquote, expect rosy expectations in 2008. The meaning, of course, that following on the sorrows of 2008 would be even more hunger and even more pain. And as Adam said about remittances, as working class Haitians here in the US and Canada endure more layoffs and cutbacks, they'll also have less of their disposable income for these remittances. And again, in Haiti, remittances are the most important economic factor. Many Haitian households are being sustained by these transfers. It's estimated at $1.65 billion a year, and it's twice the national budget, 30% of the GDP. Dwarfing the sum total of all foreign aid from all sources, whether that's promised, delivered, or otherwise. And already at this early stage is a 25% slowdown, and so that's a real concern. In addition, you have almost entirely dependent American, the Haitian economy is almost entirely dependent on the American economy. So again, you have the Haitian exports, which will be a huge downturn, as well as the subcontracting sector. And so this, in combination with the reduction in remittances, again, will mean a very, even a lower growth rate for the modest growth rates that were expected, not even 1.5%. And that will, of course, be the immediate effect. The more long-term effect is as the government continues to be pressured into implementing these neoliberal options imposed by the international financial institutions. There will be a continuation of the degradation of the national economy and a continued collapse of the peasant economy, the very conditions, of course, that have brought the country to ruin. But of course, all of this is not discouraging. I'm sorry, I just take a few minutes just to go over that, because there is a lot of despair in Haiti. But I just want to talk about, I think, where there's hope. And there's, some people say there's a historical precedent for when there's periods of recession and war in the first world. It can bring eras of opportunity and advancement in the third. And so as the first U.S. occupation in Haiti was actually ended in 1934, in large measure because of the Great Depression, and they couldn't afford to keep thousands of U.S. Marines occupying countries like Haiti and Nicaragua. And also with the multinationals severely weakened, credit and capital becomes tight for them, and so that might give local Haitian industries a space to emerge. It's also important that the shifts may also mean a change, and this is critical, in connection to and dependence on the U.S. and opportunities to create sovereign national projects. And so one of the ones that being spoken about in terms of the financial crisis is the relationship between the financial sector, characterized by the commercial banks, and the question of production, because right now the financial sector in Haiti accumulates tens of billions of gourds, the national currency, and invests absolutely nothing in the real economy. And the commercial banks, for example, extend less than 1% of credit to the rural sector, where the majority of Haitians are functioning. And so credit is instead being concentrated in the metropolitan area, the capital, in activities of speculation, exchange, and consumption. So the fiasco of the $197 million I spoke about earlier, like Haiti's US dollar assets were being held in the financial market and not the central bank, has given more leverage now for calls that Haiti's parliament be able to closely monitor how national reserves are managed. So that's a good thing. It means Haiti can invest in its national economy. And then there's always hope in and with the Haitian poor majority. Although Haiti's democratic movement is in a state of disarray, the movement remains combative, it remains resistant. And huge anti-imperialist demos actually consistently have filled the capitalist streets, and the unfolding crisis may once again serve to unite the divided social movements. And of course, there is the new international progressive anti-imperial and pro-socialist forces of Latin America, in Venezuela and Bolivia and in Ecuador and Nicaragua and Paraguay. They're offering new sources of political and economic support for the beleaguered national democratic forces. And South America, which I'm sure Paul will speak about, so I won't say anything more except that there's all kinds of projects that have been offered to Haiti, including the Petro-Carib agreement. It's interesting because in an almost ridiculously shameful way, or show, the World Bank and the IMF have expressed serious concern that these repayments on this Petro-Carib agreement would means that Haiti will be shelling out as much as 1% of its GDP in 2013, which keeping in mind that these are the same institutions that have no such unease about having Haiti or accepting $1 million a week from Haiti in debt repayment. That's it. So just to conclude, I just want to underscore that which I think is the most important for all of us to leave with today, and which is equally valid with or without an economic crisis. And that's that every democratic leader in Haiti has had to contend with how U.S. foreign policy and the foreign policies of its rich allies affect Haiti. And to balance that against the needs and the expression of needs of the Haitian majority. It has been the consistent and tragic conflict of Haitian democracy. Haiti needs to control its own destiny and rebuild its sovereignty and control its territory. And that's the only thing that the Haitian people have ever expressed, that's what they want, and they want to begin to deal with their own national crises, and they want to begin the dismantling of the programs and structures of years of colonialism and neoliberalism. That's what every major demonstration has called for, an end to neoliberalism and the associated presence of the United Nations occupation military forces. That has to become part of our demands on our government, and it also means demanding an unconditional termination of Haiti's onerous and illegitimate $1.7 billion foreign debt, along with financial restitution by the Canadian state for harm done to Haitian society in its most recent actions. So true solidarity with Haiti comes with the understanding that the pressures on Haiti will only lessen if our own government and its international partners and institutions stop undercutting Haitian sovereignty, and the ultimate responsibility of that lies with us.
Thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be on this panel with Adam and Niraj. The Venezuela Coalition, we do what we can to build solidarity for what is going on in Venezuela, which at a minimum is about the assertion of sovereignty over the country, over its resources, over its destiny. And that's, I think, a common theme that knits together the work that all three of us are involved in. A theme of my talk is going to be that capitalism in the global north does not exist without the global south, and that therefore solidarity in the global north does not exist without solidarity with the struggles in the global south. The two things are completely linked. We can't separate them out. And we know this from looking at the history of the solidarity movements that both Adam and Niraj are involved in. In the Middle East, capitalism doesn't, US and Canadian capitalism doesn't exist without cheap oil. And cheap oil only stays cheap, or relatively cheap, if the Middle East stays divided. And that's the role of Israel. It's a battleship for capitalism inside the Middle East, and that's why Palestine must be denied its right to self-determination over and over again. And that the battle for sovereignty in Palestine, the assertion of self-determination, is bound up with, comes up against the structures of international capitalism. In Haiti, there's a similar story. I do not think it's coincident that the coup against Aristide in 2004 happened when it did, because there has been an emergence a mass emergence of a struggle for sovereignty in Latin America. The big breakthrough was in Venezuela with the election of Chavez and the beginning of the assertion of sovereignty and control over the oil and resources of in that country. In 2002, the United States and Canada and the West thought that they had that thing done. There was a coup d'etat against Chavez in 2002 that was stopped for one reason only, because 1 million people in Caracas came down from the barrios and surrounded the presidential palace and said no, split the army. The rest is history. Chavez remains in office. That was a huge blow to U.S. and Canadian imperialism in the region. It could not go unanswered. They could not answer directly against Venezuela because it's too strong. The movement is too big, but they could answer by taking on the poorest and the weakest of the countries in the region, overthrowing Aristide and Haiti with an example, saying we will not go down, we will not have our authority challenged and let it go unanswered. The global north leads the global south. I'm going to look at this first in terms of economics, then in terms of politics, and then in terms of what it means for us in terms of building solidarity, the work that we have to do. Now, paradoxically, even though this meeting is about economic crisis, the first thing I want to talk about is not the crisis, but the economic expansion that came before it. Because capitalism works like this. There's booms and slumps and booms and slumps. And it's important for us to remember that there was actually a worldwide economic expansion through the 1990s, a brief pause in 2001, and then it accelerated through in the first part of the 21st century. It was real, and it was unexpected, and it wasn't caused by the magic of Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve Board in the United States and capitalism and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It was a reflection of changes going on in the global south. We know the figures now. We now know, for instance, today, the role that China played in sustaining what's happening in the United States. In November 2007, China held $480 billion of US debt. That's November 2007. By November 2008, that figure had grown to $650 billion of US debt, a growth of $200 billion in just a year. Extraordinary growth. China is now the largest foreign holder of US treasuries, of US debt. The massive debt, Adam talked about this, the debt-based, the debt that's at the background, one of the features of the US crisis, is being held in China. Now, 30 years ago, that was inconceivable. China did not exist in the world stage in the same way that it could hold that level of debt. In terms of trade between the United States and China, $66 billion of exports to China from the United States, $320 billion of imports into the United States, a trade deficit of $250 billion, a quarter of a trillion. We never used to talk about trillions. It used to be millions and billions, that was enough. And now we have to talk about trillions for some reason, I'm not quite sure. But a quarter of a trillion dollar trade deficit, 30 years ago, that was inconceivable. China did not exist on the world stage in the same way that it does today. Now that emergence of China as a factor in the world economy is not because of the United States. It's not because of Canada. It's in spite of the United States and in spite of Canada. Its roots we can talk about in discussion. It goes back to what were called reforms that were introduced inside China in 1977, 78, 79, allowing for farmers in China to become small capitalists, allowing for a cycle of capital accumulation to begin in China. It did what capital accumulation does everywhere. Where capital accumulation begins, it's about replacing us with machines, us with capital, replacing labor with capital. It began the process of creating a massive labor surplus in the Chinese countryside, leading to tens and then hundreds of millions of surplus laborers who could become the pool for the cheap labor production that Adam was talking about. On a scale, it's similar to what goes on in Haiti, but it's on a scale that's so massive, because China is the biggest country in the world, that it allowed for an industrial revolution that's actually the biggest industrial revolution in the history of the world. That came first. That story, which is a Chinese story, it's a story about, it's not necessarily a pretty story, it's not a story I'm saying I advocate, but it's a story about China, was prior, I've gone 5, I've got 10 left. Or you like the International Monetary Fund, you keep revising it. That's a story it's a global south story. It's a story of a section of the global south emerging as a center of capital accumulation in a desperate attempt to become competitive on a world scale. But that industrialization does not happen in an open field. The field into which this industrialization happened is one dominated by neoliberalism, dominated by US capitalism, and dominated by a failing US capitalism, a failing international capitalism, a capitalism which has, by the 1970s, had ceased being able to sustain productive investment on an ongoing basis, and increasingly was relying, the great wealth of capitalism was not being used productively, it was being used wastefully. It was not being used productively, it was being used speculatively. It was being used in a whole series. It's what happened in the real estate crisis, the real estate bubble, this bizarre notion of taking all of our mortgages, slicing them up, packaging them up, and selling them to different people. I mean, my children know this is a bad idea. You can't, sell something that you can see, but don't sell this. It blew up in their faces. Now, I brought charts, but I didn't put up I decided that I'm not going to put up the PowerPoint because that's technology. We don't need that. And we don't have PowerPoint, but I have the power to point. Because I think I can do this better with my hands. This is just a couple of charts that talk about the real economy of the United States. And this is to supplement what Adam was talking about. The real economy of the United States grows like this. Okay? That's the real economy of the United States growing from 1945 to 2008. The financial sector grows like this. Far higher. The scissors are opening like this. It's worse than that. Because we think of the indebtedness of the United States as the indebtedness of consumers. That's true. Consumers are rolling in debt. We think of the indebtedness of the United States as the indebtedness of the state. That's true. The state is rolling in debt. But the big debtors are not consumers, are not the government. The big debtors are the corporations. This chart has 3 lines, and I can't do that because I only have 2 hands. But 2 are very close together. One is the real economy. One is private sector indebtedness, public sector indebtedness, which is a little bit higher than the real economy. But then when you get to private sector indebtedness, corporate indebtedness, almost entirely corporate indebtedness, it is like this. The level of corporate indebtedness has been rising exponentially faster than the real economy as a whole. This was unsustainable. And China and the rest of the global south and Latin America industrialized into this system, leading to a system that could not last forever. Now here's one of the great ironies and one of the great problems. This is now collapsed. Starting in 2007, this whole system began to unwind. It began to unwind in a very, very real and massive way, leading to all sorts of problems and crises. Its problems are centered in the United States and in Canada and in North America. Its problems are centered in the dominant capitalist powers of the world. But that's not who's paying the price for it. The big stock market crashes have not been in the United States and Canada. They've been in Brazil. They've been in China. They've been in all through Latin America, all through Asia. Because even though the problems are in the United States is still perceived as the safest place to put your money. There is a flight of money going into the United States as people are terrified, investors terrified of losing their money in stock markets, terrified of the collapse of financial instruments around the world. Money is still pouring in the United States because it remains the dominant power. That comes to my last graph. My last graph has to do with what the United States is doing with this money, which is completely unsustainable. This is a graph about the money supply that I got from the Globe and Mail. I'm just going to go like this. I'll show you this. The money supply, the supply of money in the United States grows at a relatively steady pace over years. I folded this one back. What happened to it in the last 6 months? It's going straight up. The United States is simply printing money massively in order to try to paper over the crisis. It's unsustainable. Now, when Zimbabwe does that, there's massive inflation. When Brazil does that, there's massive inflation. When the Weimar Republic in Germany did that in the 1920s, there's massive inflation. But the United States, so far, can get away with it. And who's paying the price? In all the ways that Adam and Niraj have talked about, that price is being paid in the global south. The tasks of global activists in the global north are twofold. Now, the problem for the United States, there is no question that the restructuring that they will try to do, that the United States and Canada and Western Europe will try to do, will be a restructuring again, like they did in the 1970s, like they did in the 1980s, to rebuild their economies by intensifying their pressure on the global south, by intensifying the exploitation of the global south, by intensifying the use of low-wage zones, of export processing zones, and all the rest of it, by the use of the International Monetary Fund, its structural adjustment, etc., to continue the flow of money from the global south to the global north. However, the field is not entirely the same as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. I'll speak mostly about Latin America now. There's been a change. There's been an assertion of sovereignty in a way that has frustrated and stymied Canada and the United States since the late 1990s in a very important way. Think of it this way. This is 50 years since the Cuban Revolution, this year. The long blockade of the Cuban Revolution, organized by the United States, has been broken. It's been broken by Venezuela and Bolivia, this is an extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary moment. This flies in the face of all of the imperialist projects in the region. This is because of the process that's happened in Venezuela, the challenge to U.S. imperialism and Canadian imperialism, the process that's happened in Bolivia, where the referendum results have just come out and they're very positive on our side. There is an assertion of sovereignty in the region. It's reflected in the creation of new regional groupings. There's a Union of South American Republics. There's also ALBA, the Bolivarian Tour of the Americas, an attempt to say we will try to find our own way of developing that's autonomous from the imperialists and leaves control of the resources in the south. Importantly for us, that assertion of sovereignty does not happen just by states. States are important. I mean, the Venezuelan state plays a role, the Bolivian state plays a role, but underneath that are mass social movements of thousands and tens of thousands and millions. Without the million poorest people in Caracas coming down from their houses to the presidential palace in 2002, the whole thing's over with. The whole thing would be done, rolled back. Those million of the poorest people changed the course of history in Latin America for a few years. That struggle is a struggle that means something for us. This restructuring that they will try to do to get out of the crisis is a restructuring that will begin by restructuring the global south. That's how they're going to start it. But ultimately, that restructuring will then come back to us, to restructure the working class and the people of the global north. We need a challenge to the system as a whole, and we cannot do it simply by pretending that that struggle is only inside Canada, or the struggle is only inside the United States, or the struggle is only inside the advanced countries of the world. We go up together, or we go down together. So 2 lessons. Number 1, to understand the world economy, we cannot understand the dynamics of the world economy simply by looking at the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, the advanced capitalist worlds. We cannot. We can only understand the dynamics of the world economy when we incorporate Venezuela, Haiti, Bolivia, when we incorporate China, India, Indonesia, when we incorporate Palestine, the Middle East, and all the peoples of the global south. That is the only way to understand what's going on. And at the same time, that means that the only way to fully resist the pressures that are coming from capitalism is to work together in solidarity with the social movements that are developing in Haiti, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Palestine, and in China. Record number of protests last year, through the roof, the number of protests against the structure. I'm done. It's not an option. It's what we have to do, and that's what I think this meeting's about. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.